Marble Valley, Vermont, October 1899. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the clean, metallic scent of the quarries and the sweet decay of maple leaves. On a small plot of land overlooking the vast white gash of the Danby Quarry, a man was engaged in an act of profound and apparent madness. His name was Pietro Loi, and he was building a mountain around his house. The house itself was unremarkable, a simple 20-foot A-frame of rough-sawn pine, the kind a quarryman could throw up in a few weekends. But around this structure, Pietro was methodically, silently, raising a colossal ring of stone. He worked with the quarry's refuse, tons of white marble scrap, pieces ranging from the size of a fist to the size of a coffin. He was not using mortar. It was a dry stone construction, a freestanding cairn that was already 10 feet high and promised to grow higher. From the rutted track that served as a road, Ellison Whitmore, the Rutland County tax assessor, paused his horse and buggy. He was a man who understood value in terms of board feet, acreage, and taxable improvements. What he was looking at defied all his ledgers. He gestured with his whip toward the growing stone behemoth. "Jedediah," he said to the carpenter riding with him, "you've built half the cabins in this valley. What in God's name is that?" Jedediah Morse squinted, his face a road map of Vermont winters. "It's foolishness, Mr. Whittemore. That's what it is. He's entombing himself. The frost will get between those stones. Heave that whole pile apart and bring it down on his roof before February. The man's crazy." Whitmore grunted in agreement. He'd seen plenty of immigrant follies, but nothing on this scale. The Sardinian Loi moved with a quiet, unnerving deliberation, hoisting another slab of marble into place with a grunt, tapping it with a small hammer until it settled with a deep, final thud. He paid them no mind. "It's a monument to wasted labor," Whitmore declared, making a note in his book. The community had found its consensus. The Sardinian stonemason was building his own tombstone, and they would all be there to watch the winter prove it. What did this quiet man, a former shepherd's mason from the rugged heart of Sardinia, understand about the physics of thermal mass and the behavior of dead air that the most experienced builders in Vermont had tragically missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of frontier innovators. These are stories of practical genius, of individuals who saw the world differently and, in doing so, saved their families and changed their communities. If you believe that the best ideas are often the ones that are first met with ridicule, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for notifications. I promise the story of Pietro Loi's stone cairn will teach you something profound about how to face the cold. Let us know in the comments, have you ever encountered a traditional building technique that seemed strange at first but was perfectly adapted to its environment? Pietro Loi was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor was he a frontiersman in the American sense. He was a muratore, a secco, a master of dry stone, from the Barbagia region of Nuoro, Sardinia. His hands were not trained on pine 2x4s and iron nails. They were educated by granite, basalt, and limestone. His trade was not in building houses to be lived in, but in constructing pinettas, the conical, corbelled stone huts that have sheltered Sardinian shepherds from the relentless Mediterranean sun and harsh mountain winds for 3,000 years. The tools of his mind were not saws and planes, but the immutable principles of gravity, friction, and interlocking weight. He thought in terms of mass, balance, and the slow, patient language of stone. He had come to Vermont with his wife, Eliana, and their 2 young children, Lucia and Gavino, drawn by the promise of work in the marble quarries. The stone was different here, a brilliant crystalline white instead of the dark, volcanic rock of his homeland. But the work was the same: breaking, shaping, and moving stone. He was a good quarryman, strong and tireless, but he was a builder first. Their first winter in the Marble Valley, in a standard-issue board-and-batten cabin, had been a lesson in a new kind of violence. It was not the quick, brutal violence of a windstorm, but a slow, creeping siege. The cold was a physical presence, an occupying force. Pietro had watched, helpless, as the Vermont winter dismantled his family's life piece by piece. He remembered the day his neighbor's butter churn dasher, the stout maple handle frozen to the point of crystalline brittleness, snapped clean off at the collar mid-plunge. He remembered the schoolmaster, a stern man from Boston, dismissing class because the ink in his inkwell had frozen solid to the bottom, and the moisture from his breath was freezing his words to the slate as he wrote. Most vividly, he remembered one morning in his own cabin. The fire had dwindled overnight, and the temperature in the room had plummeted. Eliana had gone to roll up the thin horsehair mattress to get it away from the drafty floor, and it had cracked. Not bent, not folded, but cracked in flat, rigid sheets, the frozen fibers snapping with a sound like breaking glass. That sound had settled deep in Pietro's soul. It was the sound of a fundamental failure. The house was not a shelter. It was merely a poorly made wooden box, a sieve for heat, a container for cold. That night, as his children slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the air, he did not curse the cold. He began to analyze it. The problem with the conventional Vermont cabin was not its wooden construction per se. Wood was a decent insulator. The problem was one of design philosophy, a philosophy that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of a Vermont winter. The local builders like Jedediah Morse fought the cold with a single weapon: fire. Their goal was to generate BTUs faster than the house could leak them. It was a losing battle of attrition. A standard cabin was built with single walls of 1-inch pine boards, with gaps between them chinked with moss, mud, and sometimes crude plaster. By the time the first hard frost arrived, this chinking would shrink and crack, opening up dozens of tiny fissures. The wind, especially the relentless north wind that scoured the Green Mountains, would find every single one. This was convective heat loss, the air inside the cabin physically being replaced by cold air from outside. But the more insidious thief was radiation. On a clear, frigid night, the kind of night that defined a Vermont radiative freeze, the laws of thermodynamics worked against the cabin. The dark sky became a vast cosmic heat sink. The warm roof and walls of the cabin radiated their thermal energy directly into space, unhindered by the insulating blanket of cloud cover. The roaring fire inside was like pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The heat left almost as quickly as it was produced. The final fatal flaw was the lack of thermal mass. A wooden structure has very little capacity to store heat. When the fire died down, the temperature inside the cabin crashed within an hour. The walls, the floor, the very air itself had no thermal inertia. Families like the Morses were slaves to their woodpiles, feeding the stove around the clock, burning through 10 or 12 cords of wood in a single season just to keep the indoor temperature from falling into the single digits. They weren't living in their homes. They were tending a perpetual fire inside a leaky wooden tent. Pietro saw this cycle of frantic fuel burning and pervasive damp cold, and he knew it was a fool's errand. He would not fight the winter. He would negotiate with it, using a language it understood: mass and time. In the late summer of 1899, Pietro began his work. He did not tear down the inadequate A-frame. It was structurally sound, and it would become the core of his new system. Instead, he walked the sprawling tailings piles of the quarry, his expert eye scanning the mountains of discarded marble. To the quarry owners, this was waste rock. The overburden and flawed blocks cleared away to get to the pristine architectural-grade stone. To Pietro, it was a free mountain of building material, a gift of geology. He and Eliana, using a simple stone boat pulled by a rented ox, began hauling the scrap to their plot. For weeks, they moved stone, hundreds of trips, accumulating a vast pile of white and gray-veined marble that dwarfed their small home. The neighbors watched, first with curiosity, then with open amusement. Pietro laid out his foundation not for a wall, but for a ring. He scribed a massive circle around the A-frame, leaving a uniform 3-foot gap between the line and the cabin's wooden walls. This gap was the most crucial and most misunderstood element of his design. He then began to build. He worked as his ancestors had for millennia. There was no mortar, no cement. Each stone was selected and placed according to its shape and weight. He was building a freestanding, battered wall. It was 4 feet thick at the base, a wide, stable footprint. As it rose, he angled the stones slightly inward, causing the wall to taper or batter. This design, perfected over centuries, used gravity to lock the entire structure together. The higher it got, the more stable it became, the weight of the upper courses pressing down and inward, tightening the entire matrix. He built in patient concentric courses. A large, stable boulder would form a base, and smaller, flatter pieces would be wedged and fitted around it, creating a new level platform for the next course. The sound of his work was a rhythmic series of clinks and thuds, the tap-tap-tap of his mason's hammer shaping an edge, followed by the deep, resonant thump as a 100-pound slab settled into its final resting place. There were no gaps. Every void was filled with a perfectly chosen smaller stone, wedged tight. The outer face was surprisingly smooth, the battered angle consistent and true. It was during this phase that Ellison Whitmore made his official visit. The tax assessor drove his buggy right up to the edge of the worksite, his face a mask of stern disapproval. The cairn was now chest high, a formidable ring of white stone. "Mr. Loi," Whitmore began without preamble. His voice was accustomed to being obeyed. "I am here on behalf of Rutland County. My assessment of this structure requires a reevaluation of your parcel's tax classification." Pietro stopped his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. He said nothing. Whitmore continued, gesturing at the stone ring with a sweep of his arm. "A simple dwelling for a family is assessed at the residential rate. What you are building here, however, is what the county deems a significant over-improvement. This is a fortification. It is a commercial-grade construction in its mass and permanence. The county assesses based on improvement value, and you have improved your land far beyond the domestic necessity." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Therefore, I am reclassifying this parcel. Effective immediately, it will be taxed at the commercial-grade rate. Your bill, due in the spring, will be approximately triple what you paid last year." He expected an argument, a plea, a flash of anger. Pietro Loi simply looked at the stone wall, then at the sky, then back at Whittemore. His face was calm, his eyes steady. "It is for the winter," he said, his English thick but clear. The simple, unadorned statement infuriated Whittemore more than any argument could have. The man was either a fool or an arrogant mystic. "Be that as it may," the assessor snapped, "the tax is the tax. I'd suggest you find a way to pay it." He clicked the reins, and his buggy rolled away, leaving Pietro alone with his wall and the new, crushing weight of a debt designed to punish his strange foresight. Pietro watched him go, then turned, selected a flat, triangular stone, and fitted it perfectly into place. The work continued. The genius of Pietro Loi's design lay in its elegant manipulation of two fundamental principles of physics: thermal mass and dead air insulation. The mockery of his neighbors and the punitive assessment of the taxman stemmed from their inability to see the structure as anything other than a simple, massive wall. They saw the stone. They did not see the science. First, the thermal mass. The completed cairn stood 15 feet tall, completely enveloping the 20-foot A-frame up to its eaves. At 4 feet thick at the base and tapering to 2 feet at the top, the sheer volume of stone was immense. Marble is a dense metamorphic rock, weighing roughly 150 pounds per cubic foot. Pietro had piled, by conservative estimate, over 120 tons of stone around his home. This wasn't just a wall, it was a thermal battery. On any day with even a hint of sun, the white marble would absorb solar radiation. All day long, this vast reservoir of stone would drink in heat, its temperature slowly rising. A single linear foot of that wall at the base could store over 9,000 BTUs of energy with just a few degrees of temperature change. When night fell and the air temperature plummeted, the cairn would begin to radiate that stored energy, not out into space, but inward, into the 3-foot air gap. This air gap was the second, and arguably more brilliant part of the system. The neighbors saw an unfinished space, a waste. Pietro saw an invisible blanket. Air itself is a poor conductor of heat, but it usually transfers heat through convection. It moves. By trapping a 3-foot thick column of air between the cold outer cairn and the warm inner cabin, Pietro had created what modern builders call a dead air space. This still, unmoving air was a powerful insulator. That 3-foot gap added an effective R value of nearly 9 to his wall assembly, a number unheard of in 1899. It was more insulation than was present in the entire wall structure of any other house in the valley. The true masterstroke, however, was the wraparound design. A standard cabin had a cold side, usually the north and west faces, which were hammered by wind and received no sun. This created a huge temperature asymmetry, with the north wall sometimes 30 or 40 degrees colder than the south wall, leading to drafts and condensation. Pietro's cabin had no cold side. It lived inside a bubble. The full force of the 50 sous-degree wind chill might be hitting the outer face of the cairn, but the air inside the 3-foot gap remained still and comparatively mild. The outside that Pietro's wooden walls experienced was not the Vermont winter. It was the managed, moderated microclimate of the air gap. The cairn took the punch of the wind, breaking its force completely. The dead air space absorbed the temperature shock. The little wooden A-frame within felt almost nothing. That winter, the old-timers said, was a killer. It didn't come as a blizzard, burying the world in a soft, insulating blanket of snow. It came as a Green Mountain radiative freeze. For 13 consecutive nights in January, the sky remained unnervingly clear, a black, star-pricked dome that sucked the warmth from the earth. The temperature at the Loi Homestead, situated in a hollow where cold air pooled, dropped to a sustained 38 degrees before wind chill. With no snow on the ground to act as insulation, the frost drove deep into the soil. Fence lines grew a strange, crystalline fur of hoarfrost 5 inches thick. It was a dry, silent, and penetrating cold. For the Morse family, it was a living hell. Jedediah and his wife kept their stove glowing cherry red, a hungry beast that consumed wood at an alarming rate. Yet the heat seemed to vanish into the walls. A thick layer of ice coated the inside of their north wall, sparkling in the lamplight. A bucket of water placed 10 feet from the stove was frozen solid by morning. They lived in a small, scorched circle of warmth, wrapped in every blanket they owned, while the rest of their home was an Arctic cave. Life inside Pietro Loi's stone-wrapped A-frame was taking place in a different season. The small cast-iron stove was lit, but it was never roaring. Pietro kept a low, steady fire, enough to keep a kettle steaming. The heat it produced was not frantically trying to escape. It radiated gently into the room, warming the wooden walls of the A-frame. This warmth then slowly bled through the wood into the 3-foot air gap. The air in the gap, already stabilized by the immense thermal mass of the sun-warmed cairn, held that gentle heat. The result was an environment of profound thermal stability. The temperature inside the Loi home never dropped below 55 degrees. The ultimate proof of this stability was not a thermometer, but a piece of bread. Eliana kept her family's supply of pain carousel, the traditional paper-thin, twice-baked Sardinian flatbread, in a large covered terracotta crock on a pantry shelf. This shelf was against the cabin's inner wall. In any other house in the valley, the relentless freeze-thaw cycle and migrating moisture would have turned any bread into a damp, leathery brick within a week. Condensation was the enemy of crispness. But in Pietro's house, there was no internal condensation because no surface ever got cold enough for moisture to precipitate. Every evening, when Eliana broke a sheet of the flatbread for dinner, it shattered with a loud, satisfying crackle. It tasted of grain and sun, a small, edible defiance of the frozen world outside. It was the sound and taste of a dry, stable warmth. It was the taste of victory. In the 3rd week of the freeze, Ellison Whittemore was making his rounds, his mood as brittle as the landscape. His job required him to travel, to check on delinquent accounts and serve notices, even in this punishing weather. He was guiding his sleigh down the treacherous, frozen track toward the lower valley when it happened. There was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, and the right side of the sleigh lurched violently. The steel runner, made impossibly brittle by the 40-degree of cold, had snapped clean in two. He was stranded miles from the nearest town, and the sun was already low in the sky, its pale light doing nothing to warm the air. Cursing his luck, he saw the strange conical silhouette of Pietro Loi's cairn against the sky. It was the only shelter for a mile in any direction. With stiff, frozen fingers, he unhitched his horse and led it toward the stone structure, his mind racing. He needed to fashion a temporary skid, a repair that would get him to a blacksmith. He found a fallen branch, and seeking what little refuge he could from the knife-like wind, he pressed himself against the east face of Pietro's cairn. He pulled out his whittling knife and began to work. He braced his shoulder against the massive stone blocks, expecting the brutal, heat-sucking cold of rock at 40 below. He expected the contact to be a searing pain, a shock that would steal what little warmth he had left. Instead, he felt nothing. It was the most profound nothing he had ever experienced. There was no bite, no shock. He pressed the palm of his bare hand flat against a slab of white marble. It was not warm, not in the way a fire is warm. It was simply not cold. It felt dry, neutral, almost alive. In the vicious, life-stealing environment of the Vermont winter, this absence of cold felt like a roaring hearth. He stared at his hand, then at the stone, his mind struggling to reconcile the sensation with a lifetime of experience. Stone was supposed to be cold. This stone was not. A figure emerged from the narrow opening in the cairn. It was Pietro, holding a lantern. He had seen the broken sleigh from his window. He looked at Whittemore, at the broken runner, at the man pressing himself against the stone wall. There was no triumph in his eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, simple query. "You are cold," he stated. "Come." Whittemore, numb and bewildered, followed him through the stone passage, through the 3-foot air gap, and into the small wooden door of the A-frame. The warmth that met him was staggering, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't the oppressive, dry blast of an overworked stove. It was a gentle, pervasive, ambient warmth, as if the air itself was the source of the heat. The air was fresh and still. He saw the two children, Lucia and Gavino, playing a game with knuckle bones on a small rug on the floor. They were in their shirt sleeves. Eliana handed him a mug of steaming coffee, and he took it with trembling hands. He looked around the small, impossibly comfortable room. He saw the steady, purring fire. He saw the dry walls, free of any frost. He saw the crisp bread on the table. The sheer, peaceful domesticity of the scene, set against the brutal reality of the world just beyond the stone, broke something in him. His confidence, his ledgers, his entire understanding of value seemed to collapse. He turned to Pietro, the half-finished tax notice in his satchel, feeling like a block of ice. He didn't apologize. An apology was insufficient for the scale of his misjudgment. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. How? Pietro gestured first to the stone visible through the open door, then to the air in the room. The stone holds the day, he said simply. The air holds the stone. Whittemore finally understood. He had seen a wall, a foolish, taxable improvement. He had failed to see the system. He looked at the quiet Sardinian, a man he had dismissed as a fool, and felt a wave of profound, humbling respect. Later, as he sat by the fire, Whittemore looked at Pietro and said, his voice quiet with awe, "You didn't build a wall, Mr. Loi. You built a coat made of stone." Word of Whittemore's experience spread through the valley faster than gossip. The tax assessor, the most pragmatic and cynical man in the county, had become Pietro Loi's most fervent advocate. He tore up the commercial tax assessment, and when he filed his report, he listed the cairn not as an improvement, but as an environmental adaptation, essential for survival. But the true vector for the innovation spread was more personal. Pietro was a member of the Società Nuova Barbagia, a mutual aid and cultural society for Sardinian immigrants based in the larger town of Rutland. At the first meeting that spring after the Great Freeze had broken, he was asked to speak about his house. Pietro was not a man of words. He stood before his countrymen, and instead of a speech, he took a piece of slate and a chunk of chalk. In clean, simple lines, he drew a cross-section of his home, the A-frame, the 3-foot air gap, and the massive battered cairn. He labeled the parts in Sardinian: Satanka, the enclosure; Suentu, the wind; Susoi, the sun. The men, masons, and quarrymen themselves understood the drawing instantly. It was a language they all spoke. The Society's small, hand-cranked newsletter printed the drawing in its March 1900 issue. The article described it not as a new American invention, but as an application of ancient Sardinian principles to a new climate. By the following autumn, 6 other Sardinian families with plots near the quarries in West Rutland, Dorset, and Proctor had built their own versions of the Loi cairn. The idea was spreading not through official channels, but through the bonds of shared culture and shared hardship. Decades later, building scientists would give names to the principles Pietro Loi had deployed. They would talk of passive solar design, thermal mass storage, and ventilated rain screens. They would use complex equations to calculate heat loss coefficients and R values. They would champion the idea of super-insulated homes that required minimal energy input. Pietro Loi, using nothing more than quarry waste, ancient knowledge, and a profound understanding of his enemy, had built a passive house prototype nearly a century ahead of its time, a structure that performed better than many homes built 100 years later. The lesson of Pietro Loi's stone cairn is not simply one of thermodynamics. It is a story about the nature of wisdom. The established experts of the Marble Valley saw the winter as an enemy to be fought with brute force, with a bigger fire. Their knowledge was based on a single, failing strategy. Pietro, the outsider, saw the winter as a system to be understood and negotiated with. He did not try to defeat the cold. He co-opted its own principles. He used the sun to fight the night. He used the stillness of trapped air to fight the motion of the wind. His solution was not an act of aggression, but an act of profound empathy with the natural world. He didn't build a wall against the wind. He taught a shepherd's cairn to walk around the cabin and shelter it whole. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. We hope it has given you a new appreciation for the hidden wisdom in traditional practices. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old-world techniques do you know of that solve modern problems with simple, elegant logic? Your engagement helps us continue to find and share these remarkable histories. Disclaimer: the content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It is a fictionalized historical reconstruction inspired by real, traditional building practices. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional. The scientific and engineering principles discussed are based on real-world physics, but are simplified for narrative clarity. Anyone attempting to build a modern structure should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.